Drive down Interstate 10 in eastern New Orleans today, and the horizon fractures. Rising out of the dense green canopy of the marsh is a colossal, skeletal structure of rotting steel and splintered wood, the Mega Zeph. It sits perfectly still. On the foundations of this towering roller coaster, faded, oxidized lines are etched directly into the concrete, a permanent high water mark left by a highly predictable disaster. Today, this 140-acre expanse is a silent wasteland. Feral alligators patrol the murky water pooling in the sunken foundations of old bumper car pavilions. Thick swamp vines strangle the rusted tracks of multi-million-dollar rides. It's a ghost city. But 2 decades ago, this exact spot was the site of a massive economic gamble. If you're fascinated by the mechanics of urban collapse and abandoned places, subscribe. We look at the decisions that lead to massive failures like this one. In the late 1990s, New Orleans had a problem. The French Quarter was a global destination bringing in huge revenue, but it largely catered to adults. Families would arrive, see the history, and quickly leave for the sanitized corporate theme parks in Florida. City planners needed a reason to keep tourist dollars inside the city limits for an extra day. At the same time, eastern New Orleans was stagnating. Once a booming suburban corridor in the 1970s, the area had suffered from decades of corporate divestment and an exodus of retail businesses. Local politicians and real estate developers saw an opportunity to solve both problems with one massive concrete swing. They pitched a sprawling theme park. They called it Jazzland. The concept looked great on paper. It was designed as a massive amusement park celebrating Louisiana's distinct culture and musical heritage. It promised a stark contrast, a billion-dollar illusion of neon and polished concrete rising directly from muddy wetlands. To the local city council, Jazzland looked like an economic savior. It was projected to create thousands of entry-level jobs and anchor a new wave of commercial development in eastern New Orleans. Officials eagerly greenlit the project. They authorized sweeping zoning overrides and negotiated complex tax incentives. They were desperate for a win. But in their rush to break ground, the developers and the city council ignored the project's fatal flaw. New Orleans is essentially a geographic bowl, bordered by the Mississippi River, Lake Pontchartrain, and a massive network of wetlands. The 140-acre parcel of land chosen for Jazzland sat near the intersection of Interstate 10 and Interstate 510, right in a low-lying flood basin. On a topographic map, this site is a deep blue-shaded depression. Most civil engineers would point to it and immediately walk away. The elevation is hostile to heavy infrastructure. The ground here isn't solid earth, it's highly compressible peat and silt. The entire site is essentially a bathtub waiting to fill with water, protected from the Gulf of Mexico only by a network of aging earthen levees. Yet the developers pushed forward. They sank over $130 million into a war against the Louisiana swamp. Building a concrete empire in a marsh means you can't just lay a standard foundation. Engineers pumped thousands of tons of sand over the wetlands just to raise the grade. To support the weight of steel roller coasters and heavy mechanical rides, crews drove friction piles over 100 feet deep into the muck. They were searching for a layer of bedrock stable enough to hold the architecture. They poured a fortune into the ground before a single ticket was ever printed. In May 2000, Jazzland finally opened its gates. On opening day, the pristine walkways were packed. Brass bands played in faux French Quarter plazas. The towering wooden track of the Mega Zeph dominated the skyline, giving riders a sweeping view of the vast swamps surrounding the park. For a brief moment, the illusion held. The park was a brightly colored island of capitalism, surrounded by miles of dark, feral water. But the swamp has a very long memory. Behind the scenes, Jazzland's finances were as unstable as the soil beneath it. To service the massive construction debt, the park needed to attract roughly 2 million visitors every year. They barely managed half of that. The initial surge of local enthusiasm quickly evaporated. The developers had miscalculated. The local population of New Orleans just wasn't large enough or wealthy enough to sustain a massive theme park entirely through repeat visits. Plus, the park failed to pull tourists away from downtown. Families visiting the French Quarter found little incentive to drive out to an isolated, unshaded concrete grid in eastern New Orleans during the sweltering Louisiana summer. The operating costs of keeping the park functional were destroying the company's ledger. Running complex electronics and massive hydraulic systems in a humid, highly saline environment required constant, expensive maintenance. Rust never sleeps in the swamp. By the end of its second season, the financial reality set in. Jazzland was hemorrhaging cash. The original investors were trapped with a multi-million-dollar asset that couldn't be moved. It sat in a flood zone and generated a fraction of its required revenue. Municipal bonds were maturing and operational debts were piling up. Bankruptcy was certain. The grand experiment had stalled out, leaving an expensive, heavily leveraged playground teetering on the edge of insolvency. Just as the original developers were preparing to default, a lifeline appeared. Six Flags had been closely monitoring the struggling asset. Six Flags was an industry titan with deep corporate pockets and international branding. While the original Jazzland developers were drowning in a financial crisis, executives at Six Flags saw a cheap acquisition. They had an opportunity to buy a fully constructed theme park for pennies on the dollar, bypassing the massive capital required to build from scratch. Negotiations were swift. Distant boardrooms approved a multi-million-dollar buyout. Six Flags planned to absorb the park, rebrand it, and inject fresh capital for new attractions. They figured superior marketing and corporate scale would effortlessly reverse the park's financial trajectory. But as executives signed the final lease agreements, they remained completely disconnected from the physical reality of their new asset. They just bought a concrete empire sitting at the bottom of a sinking geographic bowl. A corporate buyout and a fresh coat of branded paint weren't going to outrun the geographical time bomb ticking beneath the roller coasters. The ink dried on the acquisition contracts in the spring of 2002. Six Flags brought more than a recognizable brand name to eastern New Orleans. They brought the deep pockets of a publicly traded titan. They took over the city lease, ate the immediate operational debts, and grabbed a fully functional infrastructure grid for pennies on the dollar. From a distant corporate boardroom, it looked like a steal. For the executives reviewing the portfolio that year, the setup was ideal. They had just acquired a heavily capitalized entertainment complex right off a major interstate, just outside a global tourist hub. The city of New Orleans, desperate to avoid an embarrassing municipal bankruptcy, bent over backward to help. Six Flags pumped millions into the property, betting they could fix the park's attendance deficit with sheer scale. The strategy was simple. Gut the local identity and paste in the standardized, highly lucrative Six Flags for P. Distinct Louisiana cultural motifs gave way to aggressive corporate homogenization. They spent millions retheming plazas, retrofitting buildings, and dropping in towering new rides to pull a regional crowd. To secure a major anchor attraction without waiting years for a manufacturing cycle, executives bought an inverted steel roller coaster from an amusement park overseas. They dismantled it, shipped thousands of tons of precision-machined steel across the ocean, and bolted it back together in the Louisiana heat. Rebranded as Batman. The ride, it dominated the new DC Comics area of the park. It was a logistical win, but dropping this heavy corporate footprint onto the site meant fundamentally altering the physical landscape. They drastically expanded the walkways to handle larger crowds. Corporate planners poured vast new stretches of concrete for queue lines, food courts, and retail pavilions. They even prepped the ground for a sprawling new water park addition to fight the summer heat. But every new acre of concrete destroyed the natural drainage capacity of the terrain. The wetlands that once acted as a giant biological sponge were paved over, sealing highly compressible marsh soil beneath a rigid crust. The environment pushed back. Running thrill rides on top of a volatile, low-lying flood basin is an engineering nightmare. The dynamic loads of a 105-foot-tall, multi-ton inverted roller coaster are immense. As passenger trains tear through vertical loops at 50 miles per hour, they generate heavy vibration and kinetic energy. On solid bedrock, the earth just absorbs it. But in eastern New Orleans, there is no bedrock. The kinetic force traveled straight down the steel columns, through the friction piles, and directly into unstable peat and silt. The constant vibration sped up the region's natural subsidence. The ground beneath the newly expanded sections of the park was sinking. The maintenance logs from this era reveal a quiet war against the earth. Engineering crews fell into a perpetual cycle of micro-adjustments. Because the soil sank at varying rates across the property, the rigid steel tracks of the roller coasters slowly fell out of alignment. Magnetic braking sensors had to be constantly recalibrated, concrete walkways fractured as the earth settled unevenly beneath them, and the cost of maintaining sensitive electronics and heavy hydraulic centrifuges in an aggressively humid, salty swamp kept climbing. Corporate accounting just treated these geological realities as standard operational overhead. Headquarters focused entirely on the yield of their capital injection, ignoring the much larger infrastructure crisis developing just beyond their perimeter fence. While Six Flags poured tens of millions into the park's skyline, The municipal defense network protecting that investment was falling apart. The geography of eastern New Orleans left the park completely exposed. It sat perilously close to a man-made shipping channel called the Mississippi River Gulf Outlet, or MRGO. This deepwater canal was a geographic funnel, a direct, unobstructed path for water to travel from the Gulf of Mexico straight into the heart of the parish. Environmental analysts and civil engineers spent the early 2000s sounding the alarm about this exact corridor. The earthen levees and concrete floodwalls protecting the low-lying basin were sinking right alongside the park. The clay was settling. The actual elevation of the flood defenses was significantly lower than the original blueprints mandated. The data was public. Federal engineering reports heavily documented the topographical threat. But corporate risk models rarely account for the total failure of civic infrastructure. The park's management team assumed the municipal levees would hold. They treated the encroaching marsh as a scenic backdrop, evaluating risk based on consumer spending, seasonal marketing, and regional competition. The deteriorating structural integrity of the city's perimeter defenses simply didn't make it into their quarterly projections. For a brief, lucrative window, that blind spot didn't matter. In the spring of 2003, the main gates swung open under the new banner, Six Flags, New Orleans. The transformation was a huge hit. A marketing blitz blanketed the Gulf South. Families who had bypassed the original park showed up for the promise of branded entertainment. Attendance spiked. The vastly expanded, freshly paved parking lots filled to capacity. The park finally hit the volume needed to sustain its steep operational costs. Neon lights from the Ferris wheel reflected off artificial lagoons. The roar of steel coasters echoed over the interstate. The huge crowds generated exceptional revenue through tickets, heavily marked up concessions, and exclusive merchandise. For 2 highly profitable seasons, executives watched the margins soar. Internal documents officially labeled Six Flags New Orleans a crown jewel of the regional portfolio. The initial gamble paid off. Developers had successfully engineered a highly profitable theme park directly inside one of the most volatile geographic bowls on the continent. By the spring of 2005, the park was a dominant economic engine for the region. Corporate planners finalized blueprints for the water park expansion, ready to double down on their Louisiana asset. The illusion of permanence was complete. Multi-million-dollar roller coasters stood tall, turnstiles spun, and the board confidently projected an even more lucrative future. They thought they had conquered the swamp, wrapping the marsh in steel, concrete, and corporate branding. But as the oppressive August heat settled over the Gulf South, the limits of this financial engineering were about to break. The deeply compromised network of levees holding back the surrounding lakes was already strained, and far out in the warming waters of the Atlantic, a storm was beginning to organize, tracking a path that would soon test every concrete foundation poured into the Louisiana mud. The third weekend of August 2005 was stifling. Heat radiated invisible waves off the freshly paved midways at Six Flags New Orleans. The park was packed. Lines for the steel roller coasters stretched deep into the air-conditioned switchbacks. Thousands of families carrying oversized souvenir cups navigated the plazas, driving concession revenue to an all-time high. Every architectural decision in the park was built for consumer flow, not survival. Retail pavilions sat right at ground level to catch departing guests. Utility grids were buried shallow in the marsh silt, just to keep the sightlines clean. Watching the turnstiles spin, it looked like the corporation had mastered the swamp. Within days, a tropical depression crossed southern Florida and hit the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico. The heat fueled rapid intensification. Forecasters tracked the system, soon designated Hurricane Katrina, as it expanded to a staggering size. By Friday, August 26th, computer models projected a catastrophic shift. The data showed a direct path dragging the eastern quadrant of the storm, the side with the heaviest winds and highest surge, straight across the Louisiana coast. Inside the park, operations continued unabated. Corporate protocols usually dictate that revenue supersedes weather forecasts until a direct strike is a certainty. Theme parks operate on tight margins, and shutting down on a lucrative summer weekend requires executive authorization from out of state. You don't halt a multi-million-dollar cash flow over a Tuesday projection. But by Saturday morning, the data couldn't be dismissed. Katrina was rapidly intensifying into a Category 5. City and state officials initiated contraflow lane reversals on all major interstates leading out of the region. A mandatory evacuation was underway. The local management team at Six Flags finally received the inevitable mandate from regional headquarters: clear the property. Shutting down a 140-acre entertainment complex is a logistical nightmare. Thousands of visitors were ushered out the front gates. Ride operators locked the mechanical trains onto the station tracks. Once the public was gone, local management executed the corporate hurricane preparedness manual. Food service workers emptied concession stands, throwing thousands of dollars of perishable inventory into dumpsters. Maintenance crews swept the midways, securing garbage cans, rolling up fabric awnings, and unhooking queue line chains. Accounting staff pulled cash from the registers and locked it in heavy-duty safes. They backed up operational databases to off-site servers. Then they locked the main gates and fled. But their corporate preparedness manual was designed for heavy wind, not the total failure of a municipal defense perimeter. Executives managing the crisis from distant boardrooms treated the impending storm like a severe but routine weather event. They assumed they'd return by Tuesday, power wash the midways, clear some branches, and reopen for a profitable Labor Day weekend. Because corporate risk relies on historical storm data and standardized insurance tables, they ignored the localized, heavily documented engineering warnings about the levees surrounding their park. So they left the core of their asset completely exposed. Deep inside the maintenance sheds, millions of dollars in sensitive electronic testing equipment remained bolted to the ground floor. The primary electrical substations that powered the attractions sat entirely unprotected on low-elevation concrete pads. No sandbags, no temporary flood barriers around the control rooms. Programmable logic controllers, the delicate computer brains that operate modern roller coasters, managing safety blocks, magnetic brakes, and hydraulic restraints, were left right where they always sat. They stayed housed in standard metal cabinets directly on the ride boarding platforms. The subterranean pump networks, vital for managing the park's artificial lagoons and drainage, were left on automatic float switches. The entire drainage plan relied on a municipal power grid that was about to be obliterated. Engineering staff followed their wind-based protocols perfectly, locked the doors, and merged into the miles-long evacuation gridlock heading west. For 24 hours, the sprawling amusement park was abandoned to the swamp, a leveraged concrete footprint sitting defenseless under a rapidly darkening sky. On the morning of Monday, August 29th, the outer bands of the hurricane lashed the Louisiana coast. The atmospheric pressure of the storm acted like a plunger on the Gulf of Mexico, pushing a destructive wall of water inland. The wind alone was severe. Gale-force gusts tore plaster facades off the Main Street pavilions and sent heavy debris crashing into the towering wooden structure of the Mega Zeph roller coaster. But the wind was never the true threat. The real crisis was hydrologic. As the storm surge moved inland, it entered the exact geographic funnels civil engineers had been warning about for a decade. The water surged directly up the shipping channels adjacent to eastern New Orleans. The aging earthen mounds and concrete flood walls meant to protect the basin faced an impossible hydrodynamic load. The defense network didn't just overtop. The mechanical reality was far worse. Hydraulic pressure caused the base soil holding the floodwalls in place to shear and collapse. The perimeter fractured. Sections of concrete retaining wall snapped, opening direct channels for the Gulf of Mexico to pour into the neighborhoods. Millions of gallons of corrosive salt water rushed into the geographic bowl of eastern New Orleans, and Six Flags sat exactly at the lowest elevation point of this depression. No one was there to witness the exact moment the surge hit the park gates. The water swallowed the expansive asphalt parking lots, breached the decorative brick turnstiles, and began filling the concrete bathtub corporate executives had spent millions of dollars building. Perimeter fences, designed strictly to keep out non-paying customers, offered zero resistance. A dark, muddy surge swept across the Main Street plazas, engulfing ground-level electrical systems in minutes. Those delicate PLC cabinets inside the ride stations were submerged, permanently frying every circuit board. Subterranean pump networks shorted out instantly as the municipal grid failed. The water rose foot by foot, finding its own unyielding level, trapping the multi-million-dollar roller coasters in a toxic bath. As the storm moved north and the wind subsided, executives back at headquarters had no idea their crown jewel of the South was completely underwater. By the time airborne rescue teams flew over the compromised perimeter, looking down at the immense silence of the flooded basin, they didn't see an amusement park. They saw a ruined, stagnant lake of debris. The deluge eventually stopped. The violent storm surge passed, replaced by a heavy stillness. The water that breached the municipal defense network was now trapped inside the geographic bowl of eastern New Orleans. It had nowhere to go. Across the 140-acre footprint of the amusement park, the water settled exactly 7 feet above the pavement. The sprawling entertainment complex was instantly transformed into a stagnant lake. Rescue crews flying over the eastern basin in early September 2005 were strictly focused on finding survivors, but their flight paths frequently crossed the Interstate 10 interchange. Looking down at the park offered one of the most surreal visuals of the crisis. The brightly colored, heavily branded utopia was utterly swallowed by the landscape. From the air, the peaks of the steel roller coasters breached the murky, oily water like the bones of sea creatures. The towering yellow loop of the flagship coaster disappeared directly into the dark lagoon. The giant Ferris wheel stood paralyzed, its lower passenger gondolas anchored beneath the surface. Brightly painted fiberglass roofs floated off the concession pavilions, drifting aimlessly through flooded queue lines. It was a stark collision of corporate marketing and absolute environmental reality. This wasn't just water settling over $1 billion property, it was chemistry. This wasn't a clean freshwater flood, it was a toxic soup. As the Gulf of Mexico surged into the urban basin, it acted as an industrial solvent. The floodwaters rapidly absorbed thousands of gallons of gasoline, diesel fuel, and motor oil from submerged parking lots and stranded maintenance vehicles. It collected raw sewage from shattered pipes. It pulled heavy metals, fertilizers, and caustic chemicals from the surrounding flooded neighborhoods. The resulting liquid was an acidic, brackish sludge, and it immediately started eating the park alive. Rust is usually a slow, creeping threat handled by routine maintenance, but in this chemical bath, oxidation went into overdrive. The thrill rides relied on precision machined parts. Wheel assemblies on the coaster trains, designed to glide at 50 miles per hour, were stripped of their protective industrial lubricants by the solvent-rich water. Corrosive sludge invaded the sealed ball bearings. It penetrated the hydraulic rams used to operate the safety restraints. Within days, heavy mechanical drivetrains were practically welded solid by rapid corrosion. The structural integrity of the flagship attractions was wrecked. Take the Mega Zeph, the towering wooden coaster that dominated the park's skyline. The attraction relied on an intricate lattice of heavily treated lumber. Standard rain rolls off wooden beams, but prolonged submersion in a caustic saltwater solution forces timber to act like a giant sponge. The wood swelled, warped, and absorbed the toxic mixture deep into its grain. Even if the water vanished overnight, the raw material holding thousands of feet of steel track in the air was actively rotting from the inside out. But the worst destruction was invisible from the air, happening deep beneath the surface within the park's central nervous system. Modern theme parks are essentially complex data networks. They rely on miles of shielded copper wire, delicate safety sensors, and synchronized pneumatic valves to function safely. Every single one of these ground-level systems was now submerged in a conductive saltwater bath. Water saturated the primary electrical transformers. It dissolved the silicon circuitry inside the heavy metal cabinets left bolted to the ride platforms. The subterranean utility trenches, designed to house high-voltage lines and fiber optics out of sight, acted as the lowest points in the concrete bathtub. They filled rapidly with the heaviest toxic sediment. There is no recovering a waterlogged motherboard that has spent weeks in industrial sludge. The entire electrical grid was destroyed. Then there was the physical weight of this new lake, which exacted a hidden geological toll. Hundreds of millions of gallons of water were resting directly on top of a concrete crust, already prone to severe sinking. The peat and marshland beneath the park were saturated to the breaking point. The deep friction piles holding the steel tracks in the air were subjected to intense shifting subsurface pressures. The rigid alignment required to safely operate a multi-ton mechanical centrifuge was ruined as the earth settled unevenly beneath the unnatural weight of the flood. But the real killer was the duration. If a flood recedes in 48 hours, heavy industrial infrastructure can often be salvaged. Machines can be disassembled, flushed with clean water, dried, and rebuilt. But the water in eastern New Orleans had nowhere to drain. The municipal pumps tasked with clearing the basin were destroyed by the surge. The park did not just flood, it marinated. The complex sat submerged in this stagnant baking liquid through the punishing heat of a Louisiana September. 30 long, silent days. It took over a month for the Army Corps of Engineers to finally seal the breaches in the levees and pump the basin dry. When the waters finally receded from the park grounds, they didn't leave behind a clean slate. Artificial drainage revealed a thick gray crust of toxic mud coating everything. It was an active biohazard zone. The once pristine midways were buried under inches of foul-smelling sediment. Desiccated marine life, uprooted swamp vegetation, and heavy debris from miles away littered the queuing areas. A distinct, oily black line was permanently etched into the plaster facades of every building, a level high-water mark drawn relentlessly across the entire property. The oppressive smell of rotting vegetation and chemical waste blanketed the humid air. The grand corporate illusion was shattered. The theme park had been returned to the swamp, digested by the exact environment its developers had so eagerly paved over. When an engineering team eventually gained clearance to inspect the site, they walked through the ruined turnstiles in heavy hazmat suits. They stepped onto a landscape devoid of life. The scale of the destruction defied standard insurance assessments. It wasn't just a matter of replacing waterlogged drywall in the retail pavilions or repainting a few rusted fences. The operational foundation of the property was erased. The electrical grid was gone. The structural alignments were out of tolerance. The mechanical components were frozen solid. To reopen this park, executives wouldn't just be financing a cleanup operation. They'd have to rebuild a heavily leveraged billion-dollar infrastructure network from the bedrock up. And they'd have to do it on top of ruined, shifted soil inside a flood zone in a city whose population had largely evacuated and scattered across the country. As the staggering financial estimates for a total rebuild landed on the desks of the distant board of directors, a quiet calculation was underway. With every circuit board fried and the foundations destroyed by the swamp's violent reclamation, could the corporation actually afford to pull their sunken asset out of the toxic mud? When the initial damage assessments reached corporate boardrooms in the fall of 2005, sentiment didn't matter. It came down to cold mathematics. Engineering teams sent back their hazardous materials reports, revealing a staggering reality. Rebuilding wasn't just about ordering replacement parts. It meant tearing the 140-acre complex down to the mud and starting over. And the physical destruction was only part of the problem. A regional theme park relies on a large local middle-class population to buy tickets year after year. After the levee failures, eastern New Orleans was depopulated. Surrounding neighborhoods were gutted. With homes destroyed, it was completely unclear if the local consumer base would ever return. There was no market left. Faced with ruined infrastructure and a vanished demographic, the executives made a swift calculation. They declared the Louisiana property a total loss. That decision triggered a bitter, years-long bureaucratic war. Back in 2002, Six Flags didn't actually own the land beneath their massive roller coasters. They leased it from the city on an ironclad 75-year agreement. The contract explicitly obligated the corporation to maintain the property, operate a park, and pay annual dividends to the municipal government. Following the total loss declaration, Six Flags filed a massive claim with their property insurers. While exact figures were shielded by NDAs, financial filings indicated the corporation received an estimated payout of over $65 million. Usually, an insurance payout like that funds the reconstruction of the property. But headquarters had zero intention of pouring that capital back into a flood zone. Instead, they absorbed the cash settlement into their broader portfolio to offset international debts and invest in highly profitable parks in drier states. They pocketed the check and tried to walk away. The corporation formally notified the city they were terminating the lease, citing a force majeure clause, an act of God. They argued the catastrophic failure of the municipal levee system was an unforeseeable disaster that voided their contract. New Orleans, dealing with a collapsed municipal budget and a generational infrastructure crisis, fiercely rejected the termination. The city council demanded the corporation honor the lease, rebuild the park, or hand over the insurance settlement to fund the environmental cleanup. When the executives refused, the city declared Six Flags in default and slapped them with millions in financial penalties. The resulting legal stalemate froze the 140-acre property in bureaucratic purgatory. For years, the ruined park sat untouched while lawyers traded injunctions and breach of contract claims. Neither side conceded ground. The corporation refused to spend a single dollar on site security or remediation, and the city lacked the capital to force an eviction and clean up the site themselves. The stalemate only ended when a larger financial crisis consumed the corporation. By 2009, Six Flags' massive debt load from years of aggressive global expansion caught up with them, and they filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. This provided the ultimate legal escape hatch. As part of their restructuring, a federal judge allowed Six Flags to formally reject the New Orleans lease. The corporation successfully shed the toxic asset, and the legal war was over. New Orleans was officially handed the deed. They won the land back, but the prize was a highly contaminated environmental liability. Desperate to avoid massive demolition costs, the city transferred the property to the Industrial Development Board to find a private developer to clean up the wreckage and restore the economic anchor of eastern New Orleans. And what followed was a revolving door of grandiose, doomed redevelopment proposals. In 2009, a company called Southern Star Amusement pitched a glossy proposal to lease the land, salvage the surviving steel structures, and rebrand the complex as a Nickelodeon-themed family park. The city council eagerly embraced it, holding press conferences to tout the return of local jobs. But the math didn't work. Once investors conducted deep engineering surveys, the reality of the subterranean destruction shattered their financial models. You can't just lay fresh track over a ruined foundation. A developer would have to spend tens of millions extracting rusted friction piles from subsiding peat, fixing the contaminated topsoil, and pouring a new infrastructure grid before buying a single ride. The required capital was astronomical. Private financing evaporated, and the Nickelodeon park never broke ground. With the theme park model dead, developers pivoted to retail. In 2011, a consortium proposed the Jazzland Outlet Mall, a plan to bulldoze the roller coasters and construct a massive luxury shopping destination. The city celebrated. Architects produced brightly colored concept art showing thriving commercial plazas exactly where the toxic lake had pooled. Yet retail developers hit the exact same financial wall. No commercial bank would underwrite a massive construction loan for a luxury mall inside a vulnerable flood basin, especially when the site preparation costs alone exceeded the budget of a standard commercial build. The developers demanded heavy municipal subsidies to offset the geographical risk. The city, still recovering from civic bankruptcy, didn't have the cash. The outlet mall was quietly abandoned. As the years dragged on, proposals became increasingly disconnected from the physical reality of the site. Entrepreneurs pitched a sprawling solar farm to blanket the old parking lots in photovoltaic panels. The city rejected it for lacking permanent jobs. Another group proposed a massive indoor sports complex and an artificial wave pool. The financing never materialized. City Hall became a graveyard for stylized PowerPoint presentations that failed to secure a single dollar of actual investment. The only industry that found a practical use for the ruined complex was Hollywood. Production companies realized they could rent the abandoned footprint for a fraction of the cost of building a post-apocalyptic set from scratch. Blockbusters like Jurassic World and Dawn of the Planet of the Apes leased the site for weeks at a time. They used the overgrown parking lots and the rusted skeletons of the roller coasters as literal backdrops for societal collapse. The city was originally promised a billion-dollar utopia that would elevate the entire region. Instead, they were left collecting minor location fees from movie studios paying to use the rotting carcass of that exact promise as a prop for fictional disasters. For over a decade, this bureaucratic theater played on a loop. Politicians campaigned on promises to finally resolve the Six Flags problem. Committees held public hearings. Redevelopment deadlines were extended, missed, and quietly reset. But while planners shuffled contracts in municipal buildings, the site itself was entirely unguarded. The massive chain-link perimeter fences were breached within months of the bankruptcy settlement. The absence of human intervention created a massive void. And in southern Louisiana, nature quickly fills a void. With the corporate owners legally absolved of liability and the city paralyzed by the staggering cost of demolition, the 140-acre concrete basin was surrendered to a completely different force. The toxic mud dried. The harsh sun baked the shattered concrete. And with no one left to take responsibility for the disaster, the swamp finally began to take its land back. Once the city gave up on its subsidized redevelopment plans, and the lawyers finally closed their binders, a heavy silence fell over eastern New Orleans. The zoning laws and legal boundaries that defined this place just evaporated. The 140-acre basin wasn't a financial asset anymore. It wasn't a civic project. It was just an artificial clearing, sitting entirely undefended in the path of a ruthless subtropical ecosystem. Without constant human intervention, the illusion of the concrete empire fell apart. The swamp went to work. Walk past the shattered turnstiles today, and the sheer scale of this hostile takeover hits you. The wide asphalt midways, once engineered to hold tens of thousands of people, are unrecognizable. The stagnant floodwaters left behind a toxic, nutrient-rich sediment that acted as a supercharged fertilizer. Seeds blew in on the coastal winds. Birds dropped them into the silt. As the Louisiana sun baked the landscape, a network of invasive plants took root directly on top of the pavement. It's incredibly efficient. Microscopic root systems sought out hairline fractures in the concrete, tiny cracks caused by the sinking marsh soil. Over the years, those roots expanded, pushing up from beneath until the impermeable crust of the theme park shattered. Vast sections of the parking lots and queue lines buckled. Towering thickets of marsh grass, Chinese tallow trees, and coastal shrubs erupted straight through the asphalt. Look up, and the towering architecture of the park is just part of the swamp canopy now. The Mega Zeph, the colossal wooden roller coaster that once anchored the skyline, is rotting away. Its treated timber was compromised by the toxic chemical bath of the initial flood, and decades of rain and sun did the rest. Thick vines of poison ivy and wild grape crawl hundreds of feet up the support columns. They wrap tightly around the rusted steel tracks, pulling the structure downward. Spanish moss hangs in dense gray curtains from the highest peaks, swaying in the humid breeze. Inside, subterranean termites and fungal blooms are actively digesting the framework. The park is falling back to the earth, one splintered beam at a time. Once the plants took over, the animals followed. The complete lack of human traffic and mechanical noise created a massive, undisturbed habitat. The bright, sprawling infrastructure was quickly repurposed by the wetlands predators. When the city's pumps finally failed, the low-lying mechanical pavilions and structural depressions across the property filled with dark, stagnant rainwater. The bumper car arena, once a chaotic grid of flashing lights and sparking electricity, is now a murky pond. Feral alligators have fully claimed it. They patrol the shallow water pooling around the rusted chassis of the fiberglass cars, using the shaded canopy of the decaying pavilion as a nesting ground. Water moccasins and copperheads coil inside shattered ground-level electrical boxes. Colonies of feral hogs root through the dense underbrush that swallowed the food courts, tearing up subsurface utility lines in search of food. The vast artificial wave pool, once a sanitized, chlorinated oasis, is choked with algae. It's a huge breeding ground for bullfrogs and waterfowl. The transition is total. This pristine entertainment utopia was entirely digested by the exact biome its developers spent tens of millions of dollars trying to pave over. But during this quiet era of ecological surrender, an entirely different economy operated in the shadows of the rusted coasters. While the city council debated impossible visions of luxury malls and solar farms and air-conditioned buildings, the unguarded perimeter of the park was systematically breached. Scrappers descended on the ruins. Operating mostly at night, they initiated an industrial harvest. They stripped miles of valuable copper wiring from the flooded utility trenches, dismantled aluminum lighting rigs, and gutted electrical transformers. They even yanked stainless steel kitchen appliances from the ruined concession stands. Anything with base metal value was extracted, loaded into unmarked trucks, and dissolved into the regional scrap market. At the same time, the apocalyptic aesthetic drew a different crowd. The ruins became an international destination for urban explorers and photographers, navigating the rotting structures to document the surreal clash of bright corporate branding peeling away to reveal oxidized decay. On the surviving plaster facades of the main street pavilions, every square inch of reachable surface is covered in layered graffiti. It's a chaotic visual record of thousands of unauthorized visitors. Walking through the overgrown midways is like navigating a strange, unauthorized museum of failure. The only sound is the wind whistling through the hollow steel tubes of the abandoned rides. But this suspended animation can't last forever. After nearly 2 decades of bureaucratic paralysis, the city of New Orleans finalized a sweeping redevelopment contract to erase the skyline. The legal authorizations have cleared. The machinery is mobilizing. The rotting carcass of Six Flags New Orleans is officially slated for total demolition. Tearing down a compromised theme park in a flood basin is a staggering logistical undertaking. You don't just dispatch bulldozers to push the rotting wood into a pile. Crews are facing a complex hazardous materials operation. Before the steel tracks can be severed with hydraulic shears, environmental teams have to extract and remediate vast quantities of lead paint, commercial asbestos, and deeply contaminated topsoil left behind by the toxic floodwaters. Thousands of deep friction piles, the columns, driven over 100 feet into the marsh to support the sheer weight of the roller coasters, must be sheared off or pulled from the unstable peat. Every rusted beam of the Mega Zeph Every shattered fiberglass gondola and every ton of cracked, root-choked concrete has to be loaded onto trucks and hauled out of the basin. The operation requires tens of millions of dollars just to return the 140-acre parcel to a flat, vacant slab of dirt. But even when the final piece of rusted steel is hauled away, the scars of this economic gamble will remain visible if you know where to look. You can't pour millions of tons of sand and concrete over a fragile wetland, drive thousands of industrial piles into the silt, and manipulate the local hydrology for decades without permanently altering the geology. The natural drainage patterns of this geographic bowl have been disrupted. The soil is forever contaminated by heavy metals and industrial lubricants leaching from the decaying mechanical rides. The delicate biological sponge that once protected this corridor of eastern New Orleans was compromised the moment the first bulldozer broke ground in the late 1990s. This ruined expanse is a glaring physical monument to institutional arrogance. It proves the sheer folly of believing that a corporate footprint could outrun the geographical reality of the Louisiana coast. The original developers looked at a sinking, low-lying flood basin, a wet depression on a topographical map, and confidently visualized a brightly lit billion-dollar paradise. They used tax incentives and engineering workarounds to force a towering capitalist engine into an environment actively hostile to its existence. For a brief window, the illusion held. The turnstiles spun, the crowds generated revenue, and a distant board of directors admired their crown jewel of the South. But spreadsheets and corporate risk algorithms don't possess the unyielding patience of the swamp. When the levee walls failed, the illusion shattered. It left behind a colossal liability that no municipal budget or corporate insurance policy could ever fully resolve. The entertainment oasis was reduced to a toxic lake, eventually draining to reveal a wasteland surrendered to the elements. As the excavators roll through the rusted front gates to dismantle the last traces of this concrete empire, the conclusion of this decades-long saga is obvious. The executives took their settlement money and retreated to high-elevation boardrooms long ago. Local politicians have finally exhausted their glossy redevelopment pitches. Even the thrill-seekers have captured their last photos of the decay. In the end, all the capital, the engineering, and the desperate civic promises simply faded away in the dense humidity. The machinery rusted, the concrete cracked, and the marsh, silent and patient, took its land back.